6:30 in Adelaide is where Dean is speaking to us today. So hi everybody, welcome. It's John Fellowmore here for Curtin Corner. Lovely to have you with us. So I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy, JCIPP. And so if you've never attended a Curtin Corner before, welcome for the first time. And of course, if you have been here before, welcome back. I'd like to, of course, begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the lands from which we are hosting today's webinar, and wherever you're watching from, on your behalf, I'll pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. We've been running these Curtin Corners on Friday afternoons for almost 20 years. Speakers from inside, outside the university, a range of topics connected to politics, public policy broadly defined, and of course today's talk is absolutely no exception. We're recording the session and we'll put it up on our website. Please take the time to look at some past talks. Encourage your colleagues to do the same, especially if they couldn't come to today. They'll get a chance to look at it. It takes a few days to go up. I mean, last week's is already up on our website. It takes a few days, but hopefully within the week, the talk will be up on our website along with the PowerPoint presentation with the slides. So all this year's talks, both the online ones like this, the webinars, and also the in-person ones we've held, are all up on our website. So I encourage you to go there. We do like to encourage debate and discussion. So later on, I will invite you to ask questions of our speaker. You can use an app called Slido. That's S-L-I-D-O. Very easy to use. Just download it from an app store. Or you can go to www.slido.com. You can do it from there, but App Store is obviously the easiest thing to do. And once you're in, you just have to press the event code. Our event code is JCIPP. So you just put in JCIPP, then you can submit a question or like somebody else's question, and I'll then facilitate the discussion with Dean based on the questions that have been submitted. And it's always easy to use your phone for Slido and watch the presentation on your computer or your tablet. So now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dean Ashenden. Dean is a Senior Honorary Fellow at the University of Melbourne. He's worked in and around education for many decades as a teacher, an academic, a ministerial advisor, a publisher, a commentator in all the major media outlets, as well as being host of ABC Radio National's Education Issues program. And if ever you read the online journal called Inside Story, Dean has often got some stories in there on education and schooling. And some of you may also remember the Good Universities Guide. Well, Dean was the co-founder and compiler of that invaluable resource. His book, Unbeaching the Whale, and here's my little, I printed it off the other day online. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. Can Australian Schooling Be Reformed? Was published last year by Inside Story in association with the Centre for Strategic Education and the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. And it is available from the CSE website at cse.edu.au. And I assume will form the basis for his talk today. So Dean, it's a great pleasure to have you agree to give this presentation. I'm going to now turn off my screen and we'll be listening to what you've got to say with interest, and then I'll come back on and do the Q&A. But of course, as you know, I'll help you press through the slides you've got. So everybody, Dean Ashenden, over to you, Dean.
Thank you, John, and thanks for the promo. I perhaps should say that I've been occupied on and off with the question of whether and how Australian schooling can be effectively reformed for a long time, which suggests that it's been needing it, at least in my view, for a long time. Perhaps if we can have slide 2, thank you. That quote, inequality is increasing, quality is declining, and the system is resistant to reform, comes from Barry McGaw, who is probably better equipped to make a judgment about that than almost any other Australian. He was, in fact, for a time, he was at Murdoch University in Perth. He subsequently became director of the Australian Council for Educational Research, and then he went on to the global equivalent, becoming the head of the education section of the OECD. So he's a heavy hitter, and he has a global perspective, comparing the Australian system with dozens of others now covered by the OECD, which when Barry was there and now is by some margin the most influential think tank on education and schooling in the world. I take, if anything, a darker view of the problem than Magor does. If we can have slide 2, what I'm proposing to do, first of all, explain why schooling matters. And that needs to be said at the moment because it's right off the political agenda. It doesn't rate anywhere on anyone's list of things that need to be worried about politically. I'll then go on to talk about what the troubles of schooling are in outline. And then third, the problem not of schools, but of reforming them. And throughout, it would be good if you were to keep in mind a question that we'll flip to when I've stopped, and that is, where would you start with reforming school? Would you start anywhere or give it away as a lost cause? So that's the line of march. Now, John, if we can have the next slide. Why does it matter? I mean, the first thing is that I think would surprise most people. It's a very big industry. It's got a workforce, depending on definition, roughly double the size of the nearest industry contender, which is health and social work of various kinds. Every or most weekday mornings, something like 4.5 million people pass through the school gates. Most people don't think of 4 million of those as members of an industry, but they are. In fact, in my view, they're the bulk of the workforce, and that is the students. There's also more than 300,000 teachers. Then there's about half that number who are variously called support staff and paraprofessionals and so on, working in schools and in systems offices and so on. So it's big. And it also matters in that it's formative. It does a lot to shape people's ideas, their view of themselves, and their view of others and how the world works and where they fit in it. One of the things that makes schooling hard to reform is that just how schools do that and how long the effect lasts and how they interact with other things is very difficult, far more difficult, I dare say, than the current leadership of the school system seems to realise. They think it can be pinned down to outcomes, by which they mean effectively the findings of standardised tests in 3 so-called basic areas of literacy, numeracy, and science. So it does a lot that's hard to track, difficult to change, and unpredictable in what change will actually do. As well as shaping individuals, it allocates social roles. And schooling and education have become, over the past 60, 70 years, a central mechanism in the allocation of social places and therefore of a competition between individuals, families, and groups for a position in a very extended and finely graded social system. And what happens to you at school has a lasting effect in that way as well. It has a big say in where you end up and what life is like in that slot. And then finally, schooling shapes social order. I mean, let me give just one example. At the moment, we are organised, or the schools are organised, in 3 sectors. And they have been that way for some time. And that organisation of things means that basically rich kids have very little to do with poor kids. That, as Ross Gittins, the economic writer, put it, Muslim and Jewish kids don't know each other because they go to different schools. So all of that has an effect, and like other effects, difficult to track, but very clear to see in the fact of the school not just reflecting a social order, but being an active shaper of it. One of the big concerns at the moment focuses on the reproduction of elites, and that's often put down to the way schooling and more broadly education works, and correctly so in my view. So look, if we can have the next one, John. Now the trouble of schools that appears in schools, one way of looking at it, and the one that is, I suppose, dominant, certainly in the heads of the system, is performance, by which they mean, as I suggested, the how well the kids score in standardized tests. There are 3 international standardized tests, each of which is administered triennially every 3 years, and of course there's the annual NAPLAN test. And whether the school system as a whole is going well or badly is often divined by looking at whether those scores are going up and down, how the top compares with the bottom, how Australia compares in those respects with other countries, and so forth and so on. I think that that's a fairly tinny way of thinking about schooling and how it works, but that we'll come back to that. The second kind of trouble is a hardy annual inequality. Now, I'm old enough to have been involved in the events of the 1960s, in which inequality first became a big deal in schooling. And equality of various kinds has at one time or another been the dominant idea about schools and what they're for. And the facts as they were in the 1960s haven't actually changed that much. What are we, 65 years later? It's still the case that some social groups get a lot more education and all that goes with it than others. It's still the case that the distance in understanding and so-called performance between the best performed and the worst is considerable and steadily increasing, and it comes and goes in prominence, but as a problem for schools, it's never gone away in basically my professional lifetime. A third kind of problem for schools has become more prominent in recent times, and it's not so much to do with what the kids know and can do as how they behave, and that registers in various ways. The most obvious one to teachers is, of course, what's euphemized as classroom disruption. And I can speak from experience, even though it's distant experience, and say there are a few things in life more unpleasant than losing control, as it's called, of a class of kids. It's a very, very unpleasant experience, and a lot of teachers get it. Some, depending on which school you're in, often or rarely. But there are lots of other aspects to behaviour too that are troubling. Probably an increasing minority, a substantial minority of kids either don't go to school, leave school, don't go when they're nominally enrolled, go to school and tune out. We could go on to some detail there, but behaviour in the broad sense of that term, what kids actually do is a chronic problem, not unlike inequality in that respect. Various fixes are canvassed, the crackdowns, and one national agency has recently set out rules for teachers about how they should run lessons in order to minimise the problem, and so we could go on. But it's a prominent strand in many schools, and present in one form or another in all. Then the last thing that's a problem for schools is, as well as losing attachment by particularly teenagers to the school, they're losing them to other kinds of institutions. So that, for example, at the moment, homeschooling rates, numbers involved in homeschooling are going through the roof. And very often that arises out of dissatisfaction on the part of either the parents or the kid or both with what they get and how they feel at and about schools. So that's just a brief heads up of the things that are of concern and are fairly resistant to reform. If we can go to the next slide, John. So the trouble for school reform is basically it doesn't work. You'll remember, I think most of you, the so-called education revolution, which was first canvassed by the then leader of the opposition, Kevin Rudd, in early 2007, and became a prominent part of the Rudd and Gillard government's agenda for from the time they came into office late in 2007 till the time they left in 2013. Much of it, as far as schools were concerned particularly, was driven by Julia Gillard, first in her role as Deputy Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, and then not, and throughout that time as Minister for Education. And the revolution certainly was ambitious, but as I'll explain in a moment, it was shallow. It had several bits to it. One was a view about what schooling was for, which was pushed very vigorously. And the answer really was the school was about basic knowledge. And that was going to be the priority. It was under Gillard's leadership that the national testing program was created, NAPLAN. She also created 3 new national institutions in a push to get a so-called national approach to those things. And there was a good deal of pressure on schools and teachers to perform, the underlying idea being that if you improved, then you would be rewarded with additional enrolments, and that if you didn't, you'd suffer the consequences as well. There was another rather different part of the so-called revolution, and that was, of course, Gonski. And the idea there was that funding would be geared to essentially the level of need in each school. It was a complicated failure after having been a huge success in public acclaim. And again, we could talk about some more if that's of interest. The underlying difficulty and the reason that the education revolution simply didn't work, not even in its own terms, and I should have mentioned, some of you will remember the boast which found its way into legislation in 2012, that by 2025, Australia's performance, as measured by standardised tests, would put us in the top 5 of the OECD league tables. And we're further away now than we were then. So it's an embarrassing flop in those terms. And I think it's also in the minds of many people who work in the system, teachers, simply, a corrosive, even destructive way of thinking about what schooling can be and of shaping it. My view, which I put in the book that John mentioned, Unbeaching the Whale, is that the revolution didn't work and that no reform will work until it tackles what I'd call structural problems, the way that the whole setup is organised and operates. And I think that there are 3 of those at bottom, and they relate to each other. First of all, is the system of governance, which is now fantastically complicated. It's got one layer in and around Canberra, and of course, Canberra provides about 25% of the total annual budget of schooling, and it uses that to turn in my view, to turn the national approach into a Canberra-centred empire. Now, that may seem a bit strong language. I guess all I can do at this stage is say that I was, some time ago, a big fan of the role of the Commonwealth in schooling. I worked for 3 years for a federal minister for education. So I've been a believer in the idea that Canberra can make a constructive contribution. In my view, it's now the obvious of that. The second of the big structural problems is what I mentioned a moment ago, the sector system, where schools are organised into those 3 sectors, where the government sector is the largest but shrinking. The mainly Catholic systemic sector, which has over time grown steadily. And then the third, the independent schools, which has boomed consistently, and particularly recently, the boom has accelerated for 30 or 40 years. Funding differences are part of the problem, and the part that Gonski tackled in a limited way. It remains the case that the least needy schools, or a kid going to the least needy of schools, the high fee privates, has about $2 spent on their schooling for every one that's spent in the most needy. And so Gonski has to be understood as a very limited approach to that problem, not least because it has imposed or put in a floor under funding, but no ceiling. It also, and this is an area that was left out entirely by Gonski, the regulations governing the government sector and the non-government sector are very different in the crucial matter of choice and selection, choice by families, choice of school by families, and selection of students by schools. Essentially, it's encouraged in the non-government sectors, which comprise about or cater to about a third of all kids now, and discouraged, not very effectively, in the government system. But so the governance and the organisation of schooling as sectors is something that the education revolution left almost entirely alone. Pardon me. And I think anything that does, any reform initiative that doesn't tackle those structural problems is bound to fail and perhaps have counterproductive consequences unforeseen. And the third, and by far the most important of the structural problems, is the organisation and content of students' working lives. That's got two aspects to it. I'll mention them and pass on, and if they're of interest, we can pick them up later. The first is that it's organised as an increasingly intense and explicit competition of each student with all others over the course of their working lifetime, school working lifetime. And of course, it's summed up at the end in the ATAR. There are things about that that are not, or to say the least, suboptimal, even for those who do well in it. For the many who do not, it's a bad and even humiliating experience. And the second thing is that learning is a more or less, or that competition is a more or less exclusively cognitive, pardon me, exclusively cognitive competition. And the development of the kid as a person and their capacity to operate in crucial things like cooperating with others or knowing how to learn is a second order consideration. One of the things that means is a lot of sitting and listening and not a lot of doing and making. And for teenagers particularly, that's a recipe for disaster. Next slide if we can, John. Now, along the way, I've been talking about both schooling and the problem with reform. And this is to sum up what I've already said, that the system is, in my view, so badly in need of reform and so structurally malformed that it is incapable of reforming itself. It's kind of like a catch-22, you know, the old one about I need the keys to get into the house, but the keys are inside the house. And that, I think, is not a bad analogy for the problem that school reform faces. I think McGaw's view, which I quoted earlier, that it's resistant to reform, is a bit sanguine. In my view, it's incapable of it. And at the moment, there is no prospect of outside intervention. And the history of large-scale interventions, the two that I've been through, one is the Rudd-Gillard education revolution, and then before that, the Carmel settlement of the early 1970s, the consequences of those Big Bang reform movements are, well, not positive, let's say. Which leaves us with the question that I foreshadowed. Is it a lost cause? And if it's not, where would you start, and what would reform look like? Who would drive it? Why would it succeed? Those are questions that I, among a number of others, have been sort of fretting about for years, decades in my case, not really coming up with very convincing answers. And so I'm very open to be educated, and I'll be listening hard to your questions. So thank you. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Dean. I'm just going to stop sharing, so we're here together. Thanks for that. You've left us hanging there on the solutions, but I'm sure in the questions you might give at least a few suggestions. Just letting people know your Slido is open and you're welcome to come and ask some questions. I'll put a couple of questions up there just to know you're in the right spot. But the app is called Slido, S-L-I-D-O. So just go download that, and our code, if you like, for the event is JCIPP. We normally get a bundle of questions, so don't let me down. People, come and send a few through, okay? So Dean, I had a couple of questions. One of my first ones was, I mean, being a federation should, in theory, encourage experimentation in schooling systems, I would have thought. That's the theory behind federation. It's Victoria can do things differently. Like the ACT has year 11 and 12 colleges, for example, and I think Tasmania does the same thing. Other states do different things. And we also have maybe differences in starting age or the type of pre-primary, that sort of stuff. I mean, does Australia use its federation structure to any useful extent in schooling? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it?
I think, as I mentioned very briefly on the way through, it uses it counterproductively, because you've got two levels of government involved in all three sectors in every one of the states and territories. So on the one hand, you've got this sort of increasingly cumbersome national apparatus, and on the other hand, you've got 8 state territory governments, which are supposed to work in some way that's consistent with an overall plan. And what it effectively means, and we've been seeing that at work, it emerged in the aftermath of the Carmel report in the 70s, but really got consolidated and institutionalized by Rudd and Gillard. And the two sides trip over each other. The system is very hard to even understand, let alone to operate, and no one really can make any clear decision about anything that actually matters. And that problem is exacerbated by the very close relationship between government and schooling. And the underlying difficulty there is that schooling is more like, let's say, defence strategy or mining than many other social activities. The time frame for reform, I think, would have to be similar to that the mining companies and highways departments, for that matter, and others take, which are, we're talking 25, 30 years. But of course, it's so closely linked to government. The time horizon is 3 years max. And so by the time you put those two problems together, a complicated machinery that trips over itself, and the very, very short and totally unsuitable time frame, it's no wonder that reform is piecemeal, patchwork, Band-Aid, to use a conventional metaphor, and ineffectual and often counterproductive. I mean, I could give an example of that, John, in the case of Gonski, but we can come back to that if you'd like to.
I can do that, because someone was actually going to ask a question about funding, and so what's the?
Oh, okay. Well, look, I mean, Gonski was initially hugely popular, In fact, in the run-up to the 2013 election, Tony Abbott, then leader of the opposition, very hostile to the underlying idea of needs-based funding, declared what he called a unity ticket on Gonski. It was that popular. And the idea that the schools doing the hardest work should get the most money had very wide appeal, and of course was just about ecstatically received in the schools, or the schools concerned. But the first thing that happened is the government changed, and the Abbott government and the subsequent coalition governments had absolutely no intention of making funding needs-based. And in fact, they went the other way. And then Abbott in particular, and his successor, Abbott was unusually frank in saying, our first concern is non-government schools. And it's now the case that the non-government Catholic schools often get more funded per pupil funding than their state school equivalents. With a similar demographic enrolment profile. And then they add fees on top of that. Plus the fact that their clientele increasingly is drawn from those who, generally speaking, get on well with schools, leaving. And so now the majority of so-called disadvantaged Catholic kids, for example, are now in the state system. And by almost any measure of disadvantage or educational difficulty, the overwhelming majority of those are in the worst funded sector, the government sector. Well, let me pause there and say.
Well, I mean, the discussion.
The thing there is the political system and the system of governance simply couldn't do what it nominally set out to do.
Sure. I mean, questions about funding and inequality, of course, are pretty central, but not the only thing, and we'll get off funding soon. I mean, I asked a question about inequality within sectors because, I mean, there are certainly huge differences within government schools I can think of. I mean, my kids went to a very nice government school in the western suburbs of Perth, but I know there are schools elsewhere, where the parents don't pay the supposedly voluntary fees. So you've got inequality within government schools. You also got between government schools. You've got inequality, I assume, between the privates. You've got the old established private schools, and you've got these newer ones, mainly religious-based, which are probably not that well off. Is the debate about inequality in schooling, is it too focused and too fixated on between sectors, as opposed to, I mean, I thought Gonski in a sense was trying to get away from that because there's inequality between the sectors and within the sectors as well. So what's the, I mean, are we framing this inequality of funding the right way?
I think first of all, you're absolutely right that the larger problem is of the distribution and use of choice and selection. And that happens within the government sector as between government schools, as well as between the schools in the sectors. You mentioned quite correctly that the independent sector is similarly these days very diverse. But insofar as those things can be tackled by funding and regulation, then the sector issue is front and center. And that's because of the way that political mobilization occurs and the fact that at the moment, the rules of funding and of choice and selection do differ primarily, but not exclusively, as between sectors. The underlying difficulty that you mentioned there, or another one, is of course the use of the housing market. And we could go into this in considerable detail. And what happens is within a sector that's supposed to oppose choice and selection by means of zoning, the government sector, of course, some people can use the housing market to choose their school, and those that haven't often cheat in one way or another, inverted commas, typically joint conspiracy with the schools concerned. And so it's a very big and very complicated mess, but the sector system is at the heart of it. Putting the three sectors on a broadly common basis of funding and regulation would be a large part of minimising the problem, but not the whole of it.
Sure. Okay. Bill's asked a question. What is your opinion on the Finnish public education model from Finland, which I know has often been talked about as the model? And maybe you can tell us briefly what is distinctive about Finland, because I know we have had various educational tours to Finland and vice versa.
Yeah.
And has it ever been considered, and how hard would it be to implement in Australia? So what is it about Finland?
Well, first of all, it doesn't have school sectors. Second of all, it doesn't have a federal system. And third, it does much more in various ways to cater to the differences in interests and capacities and futures and pasts of kids than the Australian system does. And I'm thinking there particularly that along with a number of other European countries, kids at the age, around the age of 15, 16, can opt for the form of schooling that most appeals to them. It's not unlike a much stronger system of technical versus so-called academic schooling. I don't want to be read as endorsing that particular form of making working life for kids in schools more productive and worthwhile and enjoyable. And we can come back to what might, but it's certainly better than what we have here. An old friend of mine who was for several years, the head of the vocational education section of the OECD, drew up a startling graph as many would say, about 20 years ago, in which he arrayed a dozen countries on the fraction of the enrolments that went to general education and technical education, respectively. And Australia was almost entirely a general education, whereas in some other countries, mainly European, it was not half and half, but close to it. And I think we made a very big mistake in the 60s and 70s of dissolving our tech system. But again, I don't want to say that that's the universal solution to the problem of what kids' work should be like and how they engage with it. But it does suggest the depth of that problem in Australia.
The other thing I thought that Finland was quite known for was, if you like, it's the prestige of its teaching profession. And they taught, teachers were sort of seen as, they tend to have masters. They're also much more collegiate, but also you talked about accountability as being one of the big sort of watchwords in Australia, but in Finland, you have a lot more in classroom sort of mentoring and oversight by other teachers.
Yes. Look, there's two ways of looking at it. And the question of the respect for the teaching profession and competition for entry to it is very different from Australia. But of course, what's the chicken and what's the egg? There have been endless proposals to boost the standing and prestige and prerogatives of teaching in Australia. Very, very few of them have even come into effect for the reasons I suggested, that the governance system simply can't even do what it wants to do. And in my view, they wouldn't have changed much. And it raises that problem of a reform, and that is you can't do everything at once, but everything is related to everything. And so then there's the question of how do you start, and how do you keep marching in a chosen direction at the moment. And I think that's a prerequisite, to changing the daily experience of kids and teachers and the actual outcomes of schooling. But it's very hard to see how, in the present circumstances, that can be commenced.
Sure. Okay, another question. In fact, Igor Bray, great friend of Curtin Corner and John Curtin, distinguished professor here at Curtin, goes on from this really. Every time reform is attempted, a bad situation is made worse. There are books written on education fads that have come and gone. It's all about the teachers. Okay, I mean, I think quite a lot, you actually do talk in your book quite a lot about teaching is the key. What goes on inside the classroom is often forgotten about by comparison to these big structural and funding issues that we often forget about what actually happens in the classroom. Is that reasonable way of putting it or not?
Look, one of the things that went wrong or was encouraged in the wrong direction by the education revolution was all this emphasis on teachers and teaching. Now, that I wouldn't question for a moment that teaching needs a whole lot of help, but schools aren't there for teaching; they're there for learning. And the problem is not so much in the circumstances of teaching as in the circumstances of learning. And that's why earlier on I suggested that if you want to understand let me start again. A better way of understanding students and teachers is as the co-producers of learning and growth in an inhospitable organisation of those things, which, among many other things, doesn't understand what students need to be successful. And let me stop there. And I know that answer provokes other questions, or at least I hope it does. But
okay, sure. Early childhood, someone asked about. Should we start here to try and push back the competitive pressures? Reform from the bottom up. It's going to need a total disruption of some of the discourse of outcomes, but could we start it? I mean, if the schooling system itself is too complicated because of the 3 sectors and the 2 levels of government and the 8 states and territories, is there some sort of hope in early childhood, or is that also too complicated because of the whole private sector thing?
Look, it's it's being pushed as the solution. And the idea is plausible, but quite mistaken, in my view. The idea is that research has shown the kids who start behind at school typically stay behind throughout schooling. And so what do? Well, you make sure they don't start behind. How do you do that? You provide early childhood education. I'm deeply sceptical of that. You may well argue for that early childhood education, so-called, as being valuable and or necessary for, among other things, helping women in their overloaded lives, where they're expected to be in the workforce and, et cetera, et cetera. And so childcare is a part of an overall strategy to cope with that. But as for its capacity to get more kids to be successful in their subsequent schooling careers, I think that's, how shall I say, inflated. Yeah, I don't think it'll make much difference either to the proportion of kids who are successful or to the present socioeconomic distribution of them.
Okay. Hang on 1 second. Michael Dowling. Hi, Michael. Just notes really. Pressures have ramped up, accountability pressures on students, teachers, which then lessens creativity, collaboration, real life problem solving, and flexibility. So you did talk about how the education revolution was, in large respects, all about increasing accountability, measuring things, NAPLAN, the whole kit and caboodle. And it hasn't really, well, firstly, it hasn't produced the results even on its own terms, as you said, in terms of PISA and NAPLAN. But has the actual measurement accountabilities at a revolution produced problems in its own right?
Certainly has. Yeah. Look, I mean, it might sound a bit corny, but two maxims or sayings I come back to are: nothing succeeds like success, and then an Irish proverb which says, praise the young and they will flourish. Now, what makes kids tick, and I think more generally, the rest of us, is encouragement and support in doing things that matter to us. And the Gillard Revolution was of the opposite view, that what produces what he called performance is more pressure. Pressure by itself can be a good thing, but it's not a very good fundament. I think actually that's as true for, as we talk about schools, as true for teachers as it is for kids. But for kids who need that kind of encouragement and support, and who need success to build upon success, that's conspicuously absent in their daily working lives and in the shape of their school career.
Okay, I'll try and get through some of these reasonably quickly, given the time, especially where you are, which is, what is it, 7:30 over there or something. So I'm feeling bad.
20 past.
Okay,
yeah.
we've got another 10, 15 minutes to go, but let's see how we go. So someone asks, what about homeschooling? I think you did mention it. How does this factor in the current system? Because they believe that more parents are moving towards that option, which I'm pretty sure is correct. So where is homeschooling significant in its own right, or is it more significant as a symptom of failures of the current system?
Look, my general view is that schools, let me start again. I was thinking of it particularly as a symptom. The fact that people are, I think, resorting to homeschooling is a thumbs down for schooling. And so the first thing to do is to understand it not as a good or bad thing in itself, but as a sign and indicator, a straw in the educational wind, and not a good one. As for the pros and cons, of course, they vary a lot from one case to another. It's a very big movement in the United States, and I think a lot of the Australian trend in that direction is of US inspiration. I think that one of the fundamental things about schooling is that it offers what families can't provide, namely an entry to the larger world, and that it is therefore, as well as the responsibility of parents to see that their kids get the best possible start, it's a responsibility of the public realm, which particularly means the state government.
Okay, someone also, just more of a comment really, saying another catch-22, which you finished with, was for government to reform, they need buy-in from private sector advocates, but if they argue an alternative, they'll be booted from power. So in other words, you need to reform, the sectors, but of course the sectors are the very ones who don't want to reform the sectors. I guess that's the problem. Especially as you get increasing numbers. I mean, we had a Curtin corner, I think, last year or 2 years ago, talking about the usual thing about government schools are underfunded. You need to change it, but it's a very difficult thing to do if you do it as a zero sum, because it's like, especially in upper high school, sort of close to half the students now are in non-government schools. So just the electoral logic doesn't work anymore. I mean, it might have worked when they had. It works in Britain, for example. Only 7% of kids are going to the private schools, but not in Australia. It's just too hard.
Look, I mean I think the government sector has undoubtedly been done down. In 1973, the Carmel report, which brought big money into the non-government sector, insisted, and the government of the day, which was the Whitlam government, accepted the recommendation that the first priority of public policy must be government public schooling. At that time, 4 out of 5 kids were in government schools, and in fact had been rising steadily in the government secondary sector. Now, as you point out, at the more senior levels, it's about half and half, and taken as a whole, it's a growing third and a shrinking 2/3. But even though it is undoubtedly the case that government policy deliberately and inadvertently has made life very hard for government schools, the government sector has also made life hard for itself. I think in particular, a phenomenon that's probably most marked in the biggest state, New South Wales, is the identification of the idea of public schooling with a government bureaucracy running schools. And I think it's a deeply incapable and inappropriate form. And different ways need to be found to have a public sector that is at arm's length from the government of the day and capable of things that at the moment it is not. And one reason for the prospering of the non-government sector, particularly the independent sector, is that it's found a different organisational form. I don't suggest for a moment that the government, what is now the government sector or the public sector, can or should be organised in the same way as either of the others. But I do suggest that one of its big problems at the moment is the way that it's organised and controlled, and in particular, its closeness to the government of the day.
I mean, one of the movements in West Australia, which I think then spread around the country, is called independent public schools, which sort of, in theory, gave the principal more control over the staffing and over just the organisation of the school. But the various evaluations I've seen show that it's almost led to the more residualisation of the non-independent public schools. I mean, so is that what? But so, what do you mean by moving away from is it more just it's okay to have a big bureaucracy as long as the big bureaucracy is not beholden to the elected government of the day? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Look, I think two things need. First of all, the feds need to get out of the way. They won't, because they're like all empires. They like their position at the top of the pile. Therefore, I think the best hope is that one or more states will secede from the federal system. Second, there'd be nothing to be gained in such a move were it to happen, unless it were to secede in a different form. I think that one big part of the answer would be statutory authorities, which lead across all three sectors. For anyone who is interested in that idea and what it might look like, I wrote a piece, shortish, in Inside Story about, I don't know, 18 months ago, and it was called, I think, Courage Minister. And it takes the example of the South Australian system, which is the only system which has the right fundamental attitude towards schools and school reform, in my view, and says, look, if you want to make this really work and you want it to last, here's what you should do. And in that piece, I sketched a way that could be done, and with a distancing of schooling from governments and ministers and their bureaucracies per medium of statutory authority.
Okay.
It's a complicated argument, but and one that's like most aspects of school reform, has a pretty small participant list.
Sure. Okay, a couple of quick more questions. Someone asked, someone called John, but not me, about disability loading as per the NCCD, was against the disability, basically to try and get the equal funding for schools. And how it impacts schools for students with disability. So, I mean, one of the things about schooling is to try and make sure we've got diversity in the student body, so everybody learns. As you said, people from different religions ideally actually should be at the same school sometimes. But what about the disability issue and the disability loading and disability students?
Look, disability funding is the exception that proves the rule, in my view. And I think there are things happening in schools at the moment, the great majority of them government schools as usual, that were unimaginable even 20 or 30 years ago, and are, to say the least, heartwarming. I think it's created a tremendous problem, despite the fact that the funding differentials are substantial. I mean, I happen to be aware of one kid with severe autism who is in a mainstream government school class with a full-time support worker devoted entirely to that one kid. Right? And it's a very serious commitment. Of course, by itself, not enough, because the teachers have to learn how to work with a support worker and vice versa, and the rest of the kids have to be, there's a lot of effort has to be put into making all that normal and workable and so on. But the point would be that the funding at least makes possible that kind of assault on the problem. I think there's a simple reason for that. And that is, again, I speak from personal experience, hell hath no fury like the parent of a kid with a disability. And they're ferocious. And so they bloody well should be, in my view. But they're powerful and influential. And of course, they cater to a relatively clear and relatively small minority. And so they are a highly effective lobby group pursuing a very specific and embraceable cause. Now, there are all kinds of qualifications to be entered on that, but that would be my simple explanation as to why disability funding, at least, is getting somewhere near meeting need.
Sure. Okay, a couple of other ones. This might be maybe too long or too difficult to answer in a short answer, but is there a schooling model that works substantially better than Australia's that at least to, and I would add the extra bit, to some extent might be feasible for Australia to model itself on?
Yeah, look, it's a very, very helpful question. Look, yes, there are. And I hasten to add that something I should have said at the outset. I think the system as a whole is in dire trouble, but I also think that there are many good things that happen within it. So what I'm talking about is the capacity and performance of the system as a whole, which is by no means to comment on the capacity and performance of each of its component schools. Quite the contrary. Now, as for a model that would work, let me just say it's a model that does work, so far as I can see, and I think I'm right. And it's called Big Picture Schools, and I would encourage anybody of interest to get onto their website. And what I find is a school that's radically unlike the mainstream schools within which they are housed. So they are schools within government schools, mainly government secondary schools, but also a few primary. And they are organised. How can I do this quickly? There is no formal curriculum. There is no assessment of the kind that dominates in other schools. A lot of the time, in fact, is spent not in school but out of school on assignments and projects and acquiring capacities out there in the community. Each kid belongs to a group of 17 who meet every day. They are with that one teacher for the whole of their career in a big picture school. And that teacher is the go-to person to organise their work as kids. And certainly in a number of their schools and for many of their kids, it produces remarkable results. I just read, as it happens, last week, a senior thesis by a big picture kid who is autistic and conducted a very forensic analysis of what's the matter with the way that schools cope with autistic kids. It was, I mean, I speak now from experience as a tertiary lecturer, first, second year uni standard easy, except in length, it was well up to the standard of most undergraduate honours theses.
Okay.
And I could
we'll check it out.
Yeah, I could also just talk about, a very different kid who got hooked on basically poultry farming.
Okay.
On how to get a better deal for chooks.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't done it
now,
justice, but it is worth looking up. Yeah.
Sure. Big picture schools. Okay. Other quick questions. It's a nice question, this one. It sort of follows on from what you said, I think, to some extent, nice segue. What do you see as the purpose of schools? Surely the reform should have to do with purpose, because it seems schools are so often just keep teenagers off the street and babysitting. So what is the purpose of schools?
Look, another very good question. And it's actually got to be the starting point of any thinking about what reform should look like and also how it can be done. I'll give a very shorthand answer because I've talked too long. In my view, schools can and should be places where every kid gets a safe, happy, and worthwhile 12 years. And that's their first and primary purpose. There are a whole lot of things that follow from that, including a conception of reform. So we've danced around the question of what would constructive reform look like, and in my view, it would look like saying in 25 years' time, every kid will get a safe, happy, and worthwhile 12 years at school, and in the meantime, we will do whatever we need to do and get rid of whatever we need to get rid of to make that happen. The present approach to reform, which is to improve this, tackle that, and put a bit more effort into the other and so on. The best it can hope for is a situation that's not as bad as we have. And I think if you do start with that question, what are they for, and make that the object of your political efforts, then we couldn't do worse than we're doing at the moment.
Okay, next question from Michael again. How can we address the loss of expertise as many teachers leave the profession, often within 5 years, unlike those who saw it as a long-term vocation decades ago? So the whole teacher turnover is seen as a big issue. I was thinking, is it? And secondly, how do we arrest that?
Look, teaching, like a lot of occupations, I mean, I think of police or care workers or nurses, or, we go on, will say they're in deep trouble. And that people are leaving the profession and that morale is falling and so on. I mean, you could transfer the descriptors almost from one occupation to another and be right in every case. The problem, I think, of a loss of teaching expertise is real. It's not as large as the failures of the other end of the pipeline, who's coming in and in what numbers and how they're trained, but it is a chronic rather than an acute problem. And once again, to harp once more on it, there have been many proposals made, certainly for the past 15 years, about how that can be fixed. And in my view, first of all, they're not picking the right target. The right target is not teaching but learning. And second, they're trying to fix one bit of a complicated machine or an ecology, if you like, not rather than in an isolated way, rather than within a comprehensive plan for improvement implemented over extended periods of time.
Okay, last couple of things. So this is more of a comment, just saying that our school system doesn't seem to match up with the overarching goals of schooling, e.g. the Alice Springs Declaration. We talked about the goals of schooling before. Michael also says, why do we always follow the failed or less successful systems like the US or the UK instead of much more successful Finland, e.g. because we used to level peg with Finland, and you could argue, I know Canada, a few other ones too. So, but that's a broader issue. Why does Australian political economy and public policy always try to follow the US and the UK? I guess it's partly just because English language influence through the media and whatever. I mean, it's not unique to education that we tend to look at the US and UK rather than other countries. I think it's fair to say, isn't it?
Well, first of all, they're all part of the Anglosphere. Everyone speaks English. Second, the US is a federation in the same way as Australia, and as is the UK in a rather different way. And so therefore there's a kind of similarity there and a kind of affinity that doesn't exist with, for example, Finland. But it's also to do with cultural power. I mean, I don't think I need to elaborate on how that worked back in the days when ABC announcers spoke with what they took to be a toffee English accent. It was in the ether. but that's been completely overtaken in the past 40 or 50 years by the United States. And you can trace it very concretely. I mean, for example, the most authoritative single research institution in Australia was set up by the Carnegie Foundation in the 1930s. And it modelled itself on research in the US. This is what, nearly 100 years ago. And since then, I could, off the top of my head, I could list the number of interventions, almost incursions, in Australian schooling and education by the US. So it's by no means similarity or affinity alone. It's all to do with cultural power. And some of that has been direct from the US, a lot of it, and also some of it's been through an intermediary, namely the OECD, which, as I mentioned, is by far and away the most influential think tank in the world, much more influential in Australia than any Australian think tank about schooling, and deeply indebted to the US view of the world, in my view, moderated somewhat by the Europeans and their social democratic instincts, but drawing heavily on US social science, US ideas about school and what it's for.
Okay. Given the time, last question, a quick one. Should we dump NAPLAN?
Yes, and if it's a case of keeping it or dumping it, I'll go for dumping every time. I would much rather keep it in a substantially changed form and way of using it. But it, in many ways now, sums up all that's wrong with Australian schooling and school reform.
Okay,
it does a lot more harm than good. Yeah.
Okay, a subsidiary or a follow-on from that, given my, also I've got my other hat, which is with the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success, which is about higher education. Should we dump ATAR?
No, but the reform of selection of course and institution by students and of students by course and institution is in serious disarray. It was dominated for many years by ATAR. It is no longer, except in the high-end institutions and basically the more abstruse disciplines, mathematics, physics, and so forth. But as you would know, the ways of getting into uni these days are almost as numerous as the number of students. And I happen to be aware of a major initiative to shift the basis of tertiary selection from the use of rank order, as expressed by ATAR, to a matching of the profile of the student on the one hand and the course on the other. Now, it's early days on that project, but a very large research grant has been made, and I'd better disclose at this stage that it's run by my wife, which is how I know about it. But I think it's representative as well as important, and it's representative of a general feeling that the ATAR, a bit like NAPLAN, does a lot more harm than good. But it's also the case that powerful courses, powerful institutions, and powerful families like it a lot.
Okay, well, on that moment, moment, I will just have to give it. So I have to say, we're going to end, I'm afraid. There are a couple other questions here, but it's getting too late. It's already 5:20 here, and it's very late. You've been very generous with your time, Dean. So look, on behalf of all our audience. Thank you firstly for your questions, all the audience, and secondly, Dean, thanks very much for your generosity in giving your presentation and spending so much time on the questions and answers. It was very helpful and very enlightening. I once again recommend Dean's book. Here we go, Unbeaching the Whale. So please check that out.
Thank you, John.
Online, it's well worth a read. And like I said, if you want to pick up some of Dean's other writings, he writes quite regularly in a online magazine called Inside Story. So you can find some of his stories, some of his articles there. So Dean, thanks very much. It was really great. And hopefully we'll see you again. Okay.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the those tuning in.
Thank you very much. And for everybody else, that's it. Next Friday, we're actually going to have an in-person, face-to-face Curtin Corner, shock horror, here at Curtin. It'll be at 4:30 start next week with Paul Nichols, who heads the WA Chem Centre, which has been around since the 1890s, based here on campus at Bentley, talking about the essential and fascinating work of the Chem Centre. So I recommend that if you're here in Perth. Until then, have a great weekend, and thanks for watching Curtin Corner. Good night.